For Dr. Andrew Colombo-Dougovito, he wakes up every morning with one mission in mind. He wants to help individuals with disabilities solve problems and come up with solutions as it relates to access to opportunities and physical activity. Using a radical pragmatic approach, he uses his expertise in mixed methodology to employ qualitative and quantitative methods to examine the motor development and physical activity of autistic individuals throughout the course of their lifespan. Currently, Andrew serves as an assistant professor at the University of North Texas, where he serves as the director of the Physical Activity and Motor Skills Program. Additionally, he serves as the director of the Disability and Movement Research Lab. He spent some time with me this week to discuss his work in the field, the advancements we've made in treating autism, and so much more. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. Professor, if you're ready, I'll welcome you to the program, and I'm excited to be with you this morning to talk about your work in autism, the autism spectrum, and all the great work you do at the University of North Texas. Great to be with you this morning, and thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hey, Professor, before we dive into your work on the autism spectrum, as you may know, this month is International Women's History Month. So I'm curious to know about the impact that women have had on your life as well.
Tons. I honestly, I can say without a single shred of doubt, I wouldn't be doing the work I'm doing without the fantastic support of my wife. She was a champion very early on, and encouraged me to delve in, to do a PhD, to get my work, to really delve into this area, and has been 100% supportive of everything that I've done. So I really can't. Without her support, I wouldn't be here. And I think I also have to give credit to the amazing women teachers that I've had over the years, all the way from my kindergarten teacher through to my collegiate instructors, all wonderful role models and all giving me a great path to go down, and encouraging me to continue to do this work.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, without women, none of us would be here, right? So
Yeah,
it's very
exactly.
important to pay homage to them. But when we look at your work, Professor, you work to understand the behaviors and the movements of people with autism at the University of North Texas and through your research. So I'm wondering if you could just give me a broad overview of the work that you do and why it's so important to you.
Yeah, sure. So I focus on motor patterns and physical activity behaviors of autistic individuals across their lifespan. And I got started in this work because I was a physical education teacher for a number of years before doing my PhD. And I taught general physical education. So I taught every kid that was in the school. And physical education happens to be one of the places that most kids with disabilities are what at the time was considered mainstreamed, right? They were put into general education classrooms, even though they may have been in self-inclusive or special ed classrooms. And as a young physical educator, teaching students with disabilities, I started to notice my autistic students move differently. And I just inquisitively wanted to know why, right? I mean, physically, they were very similar to my non-autistic students, but they had motor delays, or they may have had certain movement pattern differences that my other students didn't have. And so that kind of created a seed for doing this type of work. And so when I went to the University of Virginia, I started working with doctors Martin Block and Luke Kelly, who've been in the field for each individually over 20 and 30 years. And they helped me down the path of examining motor behavior and really questioning how we teach movement skills to individuals overall, but also for folks with disabilities. And since getting my doctorate, and I've been down here at the University of North Texas now, I'm in my 4th year, I've started to broaden my focus on my research, and I've started to look more at adults because we really don't have a lot of great information about adults. And I've started to really take a critical lens to examining physical activity. Oftentimes I think when we look at physical activity behaviors, or we read reports, we often see kind of the negative side of it, right? People don't engage in physical activity as much as, say, an able-bodied individual does. And I think a lot of that work sort of assumes that the fault is on the individual, right? That, for example, in my work, the autistic individual is not motivated to do physical activity, or there may be something inherently at a deficit or an impairment which is hindering their physical activity. And I like to shift that lens a little bit and look at society, right? What are the systemic barriers that limit an individual's ability to access physical activity, right? Because in the work that I've done recently with adults, there's motivation to do activity, right? There's a want to do activity. And oftentimes there's a benefit, right? Individuals either have reduced anxiety, or maybe, they just feel better, but they're also balancing that with, having to go into environments that aren't inclusive for them, right? They're sensory, very overstimulating. They may not have all the tools or they may not have all the support they need to be successful in those environments. And so that's where my work has really focused on in the last few years.
And I know that you also work to understand the societal and environmental structures which influence physical activity, engagement, and skill development to ensure that people with disabilities have equal access to equal opportunity. So I'm wondering if we could dive a little bit more into that discussion as well.
Sure. And maybe it'll help to kind of frame my research lens and kind of where I come from as a paradigm, right? And so I spent a lot of my early career kind of thinking about it and defining how I define truth, right? And how I might research truth. And a lot of research that most people are familiar with uses a post-positivist paradigm, right? Where there's sort of a singular truth, and you're testing and retesting hypotheses in order to, ultimately figure out kind of where that truth is, right? You can't ever prove that truth, but if you disprove enough things, you can reasonably say that something is true. As I started to delve into this, I came across constructivism in qualitative work, and this idea that there's not singular truths, but everybody's truth is constructed. It's a little bit different, right? And so your experiences of things are different from mine, right? So you may have things that are true in your experiences that are different from mine. And again, that didn't really fit with how I was thinking in terms of research. And that's what ultimately got me to looking at pragmatic paradigms, which is where I fall in with doing mixed methods work. And so I use qualitative and quantitative methods in my work. And really, when we look at pragmatism, I'm not interested in knowing what absolutely is the best, most effective method of getting people to do physical activity. That's really not my, it doesn't motivate me. What motivates me is trying to figure out what works, right? And so if I look at a problem and I see something is not working, I want to know how we can improve that situation, right? How can we make it better? It doesn't necessarily have to be the best thing, but how can we get somebody into a better place where they can have a more successful outcome, right? That they can meet the needs that they need to. And as I read about pragmatism and all of these different paradigms, I also fell into radicalism, right? This idea that there's no singular structure that absolutely cannot, it's without repute, right? In my mind, there's no sacred structure, there's no sacred institution, there's no sacred rules for games, right? Physical activity in my mind can be anything. And I think particularly in the US, and in Northern, Western, Eurocentric cultures, we tend to frame physical activity in very certain ways. And I think that can be very limiting when we're talking about improving health outcomes for individuals with disabilities, right? I mean, you yourself are going to move differently than somebody who does not have spastic cerebral palsy. An autistic individual is ultimately going to move in a way that is different from a non-autistic individual. And just because there's, more efficient ways or effective ways that we've sort of determined, doesn't necessarily mean everybody has to move that way. And if we can get people to a point where they are competent and they are comfortable and they are supported, then we can start to get them to engage in physical activity and get benefits from it. But if we only have a narrow view of what physical activity can be, then it's kind of hard to work within that just really small, narrow band. And so when I apply that lens to my methods, I'm interested in really looking for the solutions, looking for ways to help improve people's outcomes in a way that they want them improved, right? Not that I, a faculty member or a researcher, say, hey, this is the best, right? I'm going into your community and I'm saying, what do you want? And how can we get you to a place where you are meeting the goals that you want to meet? And then critically analyzing, all of those situational environment elements that are around, particularly for my work, the autistic experience. And, instead of focusing on fixing the individual or correcting the individual to help them fit or cope within certain situations that they may encounter, I really attempt to shift that praxis and focus on society and expect society to change and adapt and be modified so that individuals can be supported and their needs can be met instead of the other way around.
Professor, just from a more broad perspective, I'm curious to get your thoughts on the advancements we've made in giving people with autism opportunities in terms of physical activity. I know communication for people with autism is big, and providing them societal independence. I'm curious to get your thoughts there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of going from that, my previous comment, I think it's important that we frame the question, just as you did, not as we're trying to treat or fix individuals, that we really are trying to help, that we're trying to modify the other variables, right? People can't fix themselves, right? There's certain elements, that people may want to change, but ultimately, it's often certain barriers in society that are ultimately the most limiting, right? And when we look in terms of progress, I think we're doing a lot better. I think it is certainly trending in the right direction, but I think we have quite a long way to go. In my short time within this work, I've seen autistic individuals gain much more agency, and they have a larger voice in advocating for services, particularly within certain organizations, but yet they're still marginalized within those spaces, and their voices still aren't given as much weight as they should be. And we still have a lot of work that is really driven by antiquated, historical scientific thinking that tends to be rooted, in historical oppressions, right? And I don't think a lot of work is done with malicious intent, but when researchers particularly are, ignorant of eugenic and racist pasts, particularly within certain methods of research, it's no less malicious in its perseveration, right? And so as researchers, I think we have a responsibility to learn about what those historic inequities have been, and to correct them in moving forward. And so within my work, I tend to use participatory methods as a framework for the type of work that I do. So I often work very closely with community members or certain stakeholders within my work to make sure that, as a researcher, I'm coming in and I'm being respectful of the needs of the folks in that community, as well as, the outcomes of my study are developed and designed in a way to be most impactful, right? They're what the community wants as an outcome, not necessarily what I think is best as an outcome as a researcher.
And I know, Professor, that you teach and work at the University of North Texas, and you also serve as the director of physical activity and motor skills program, and the director of the Disability and Movement research lab as well there in North Texas. So I'm wondering if you can tell me about the work, the advancements that you've made, and how proud of the work that you and your staff have done there.
Yeah, I think the thing I'm most proud of is the service that we've been able to provide for families. Obviously, COVID has limited that work pretty drastically over the last year. We have a lot of students who have pretty complex medical needs in terms of kids with disabilities that we provide services for. And so it's been kind of hard when you're considering college students, as well as making sure that they stay healthy and all the other regulations that have gone into it. So we haven't been able to do much over the last year, but hopefully, as knock on wood here, that as things start to somewhat make their way back to kind of in-person activities, and we start getting people more vaccinated, and potentially, hopefully sometime in 2022 we can get back to that work. But I'm really proud of being able to provide the services for the families in the community, and all of the work that we've done here is for free, and it's tied to a course that I teach for undergraduate students where they look at motor skills, movement instruction for working with individuals with disabilities in whatever their future career might be, whether it's a physical education teacher or a physical therapist, or maybe they go on to be personal trainers or coaches. And through this, through my motor skills program, they're allowed to, or not allowed, they have the opportunity to teach and work with kids as young as 3 all the way up to young adults, and even adults, in their 30s who, with a variety of disabilities. We've had folks with cerebral palsy, we have individuals with Down syndrome, we have autistic youth, we've had individuals with visual impairments or hearing impairments who've come in, and our students get to work with them. And, with little money and little marketing, most of it's word of mouth. We've, over the course of 10 years that this program's existed, we've provided services to well over 150 families in the Denton-Fort Worth area.
Well, that must make you feel very good that you're making a positive difference. I live my own life by saying that I has sort of adopted that goes something like inclusion is the gateway to independence. So I applaud you for giving students and people with autism their own sense of independence. And I wanted to commend you for the work that you do there, Professor.
Oh, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I often feel, odd receiving those compliments. And I talked to a colleague of mine the other day about, when oftentimes we tell people, what we do and the work that we do. And I think there's a part of society, at least in America, when I come across this, that people often look at, what I do is beyond reproach, right? It's stuff that they may not to do, or I have immense patience or what have you. But, it really comes back to wanting to make a positive change. And I think anybody really, if that is your goal, you do that work in different ways, right? And when you see an area that has inequities and has inequalities, that you hopefully would try to change that. And I just happen to really fall into the field of physical activity. Just by chance, I happened to be there. It was never really a plan of mine to get to a place where I am now. But throughout the time, I really recognized that, things aren't equal, right? And that to me is not fair. And that's what I want to make a change in. And, I myself consider myself disabled. I have ADHD and depression, and those have changed how I view the world, right? How I see and experience different things in the world. And though I may not have certain experiences that say someone with a physical disability or even something like autism, I don't have those experiences. I do recognize that there are systemic structures, particularly around physical activity, that don't work for me, or that I have to adapt to, or I have to find a way to cope. And that motivates me to do this work that I'm doing here, is if I'm experiencing this, right? And oftentimes, particularly my ADHD has helped in my academia, right? I mean, most people don't recognize that though inattentiveness is a part of ADHD, I can hyper focus. Right? I can sit down and do work for 8 hours at a time if I'm really interested in something. And, I'll forget to eat, I'll forget to do other things. And it could be positive, right? Thankfully, most of the time it's hyper focusing on the work that I do. But there's sometimes if I get distracted, I'll spend 6 hours researching something that has nothing to do with what I should have been doing for the day. And if I'm experiencing those things and I'm working within a system that doesn't necessarily work for me all the time, I can only imagine how it's not working for somebody else. And so that's where I'm motivated to say, okay, if this isn't working here, how can we make it better, right? An individual, I can't fix myself, right? I can't fix my ADHD. I can help control it. I can learn coping mechanisms. I can, use certain strategies to help me through the day. But ultimately, I'm doing all of those things in a system that is not designed to accommodate me most of the time. And that is often the case when we look at physical activity, particularly for folks with disabilities. We're asking them to do activity in environments that are not designed to accommodate them. And so it's no surprise that just in reference to autistic individuals, that many individuals do not get the daily recommended physical activity every day, that adults are often excluded from, or don't feel like they can go to certain spaces to do physical activity because it is just not welcoming for them. And so for me, that's where we have to find the solutions. That's where we have to make the changes in order to make sure that folks can actually access that, right? And I know Canada's a little bit different, but in the US, we've had the Americans with Disabilities Act for over 30 years now. And that was supposed to remove barriers to access for individuals with disabilities. And I can tell you, we still have a very, very long way to go to get to a point where people don't have to just simply fight for access, right? That they're a part of that community, right? They feel like they have the agency. And, I read the other day, if you have to ask for accommodations, that's not really inclusion, right? If you have to ask to be in a space, you're not really being considered, right? And so I think that goes a long way to what you just said about access inclusion is the pathway to being a part of everything. And I think that's where we have to start. And that's really where I situate a lot of my work.
Absolutely. Here in Ontario, we have something that our provincial government implemented called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And the intention of the act, it was adopted in 2005. And the intention of the act was to make all areas accessible within the province, whether it be transportation, communication, employment, etc. by 2025. And while we've made significant gains in the province, there is still much work to do, so I can relate there as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Professor, this is the old sports reporter coming out in me. I started my career as a community sports reporter for a community television station, and I've always had a passion for sports. So my next question has to do with, as it relates to physical activity, when possible. Can you just talk about the benefits that sports can give people with autism?
Sure. And I think particularly within, Eurocentric cultures and Western cultures like we have in Canada and the US, I often think that sport tends to get kind of a prioritized position, right? We look at sport as sort of the pinnacle of activity, right? And I think when we frame sort of health in that light, that we do a little bit of a disservice, right? I love sports. I played sports my whole life until I retired from rugby, in my mid-20s. And I still participate in certain things. I'm a mountain biker and climber, and I do a lot more sort of outdoor recreation activities now as a young adult. But as society, we do put sports, in the center of things, right? We have sports heroes. We've held sporting events at the professional and collegiate level during a pandemic, right? I mean, we very much prioritize sports in the US and in Canada. And when we talk about it in a health frame, particularly for autistic individuals, again, in this is a bit of an overgeneralization, but in the work that I've done, a lot of adults and a lot of individuals didn't find value in the competitive activities, right? And it was often when sports became competitive, it was the time that those individuals really kind of took a step back from doing either that activity or doing activity at all, just because that was not something that interests them. And it often may have even been a detriment, right? They may not have been as skilled or as coordinated as their peers, and so they really stood out. And so it may have been opportunities for bullying. In another study that I had done just recently, one of the young adults I was talking with mentioned that particularly physical education for them was a nightmare And it took until their mid-30s before they were able to, actually enjoy physical activity again, where they would actually enjoy walking or maybe even running. And so, again, as a society, I think we do a disservice by often focusing on sport, particularly, and particularly organized sport. But not to say that it's not a benefit, right? Not to say it doesn't have a place. I think there's been tremendous opportunities. There's the story that came out a few years ago, I guess a few years ago now, of the young autistic man who received a Division I scholarship to play basketball at Kent State. And so I think there's these wonderful opportunities for individuals, and particularly when we give them space and agency and accommodation and support. But I also think we really need to understand that as a society, most of us aren't going to play in the pros. Most of us aren't going to play a competitive sport, when we're adults. But that doesn't mean we can't be physically active, right? And it doesn't mean that we can't build in opportunities to be physically active. And yet, many of our opportunities focus on kind of a competitive aspect, right? We have, adult leagues to do certain sports, right? Whether it's, kickball or soccer, there's all these different opportunities. But for some adults, particularly for some autistic individuals, doing the competitive piece may not necessarily, be interesting to them. They may be actually dissuaded from joining that opportunity. And you have to have a certain skill level, right, to be competent in order to join, a pickup game, whatever it is. Yet, I think certain elements like, there's a meetup app, which, kind of brings different groups of communities together to do a certain activity in it. And some is, hiking, right? And so people can join and do other people who like to hike, right? And they can kind of collaborate and find a community and a network there. And so I think as we move forward in trying to find a space where, again, we want people to be healthy, right? And we know moving our body is one way to be healthy, right? It's a huge part. We're designed to move, right? We're not designed, and we haven't evolved to, sit behind a computer screen or sit on a couch for hours on end, right? We're meant to move and use our bodies. And we have to find ways that are good for us, right? And everybody moves a little bit differently. And I think as we, particularly as kinesiologists, right, people who study movement and who teach movement, that we have to move beyond sort of the standard ways, right? The correct way, the correct form for doing certain activities, and recognize that sometimes the outcome is what's important, right? If I can't throw a ball the exact same way as a professional baseball player, that doesn't mean that I can't play, right? It doesn't mean that I can't go out and toss the ball with a friend or get activity that way. But if it's always told to me that you have to throw this particular way and I can't, then I don't feel confident about it. And ultimately, I'm not going to do it. And so I think, we really need to pay attention to how we are adapting opportunities and how we are providing accommodations for people who want to play. And even if you think of rec opportunities, right? You think of, the Y in your community, the YMCA, or, we have the Denton Recreation Center where, they have basketball and other opportunities. And oftentimes those aren't really guided by anybody except the people who go and play, right? There might be a group of people who show up every Tuesday who play a pickup game of basketball. But if you're a wheelchair user and you show up to that game and the people there don't know how to accommodate for you, they don't know how to modify the rules, so someone in a wheelchair can participate in that game then you, as the individual who may be a wheelchair user, aren't going to show up, right? You're going to miss out on that opportunity. So I think, we have a long way to go to frame how we do activity. Not just for folks with disabilities. I think even able-bodied folks, there are many people in the world who don't get enough physical activity, and oftentimes they don't feel like they have the skills in order to go out and do those things. And particularly kinesiologists are people who have great success particularly in doing sport and physical activity, right? I mean, I was quite successful in my youth, and that's probably why I ultimately felt confident enough to go down this career path and to be a teacher and to do research in this area. But not a lot of people feel that same way, right? And I think that's an area we really need to pay and really need to focus on as a profession in order to help folks out.
And Professor, I'm curious to get your thoughts on what you like to do when you aren't working. I know you're a mountain biker and you like the outdoors. And how do you want your legacy to be defined? I'm wondering if you've given any thought to that.
Yeah, so I'll speak a little to the first one, and then I'll touch on your second point there. So when I'm not working, I try to get outdoors as much as possible. Nature is really a healing place for me. The working environment is often difficult for my ADHD, right? I really have to focus. It can be quite tiresome, right? It's just at the end of the day, sometimes I'm just mentally exhausted from really having to rein myself in and focus and pay attention. And it's a balancing act, right? And for me, when I can get out into nature, and whether it's mountain biking or hiking or climbing, it just really lets me be present and in that moment, and actually focus and pay attention to one particular thing, right? I mean, when you're mountain biking or climbing, your attention is on that task, right? There's very little freedom to be able to just let your mind wander. And so it's really helpful because it kind of lets me reset myself. And so, whenever I find opportunity, whenever it's a decent day, whether it's, in Texas, we have 110 degrees sometimes during the summer. And so trying to find the times and do that really, really helps me. And there's been times where I've sat down at a computer and tried to do some work and just said, nope, it's not happening right now. And I need to go for a walk. I need to get outside and just instantly feel better. And, to your second question about legacy, I think I'm a little early in my career to think about my legacy. I hope I have a long time left to do this. I'm in my fourth year. I certainly expect to be doing this for the next 20, 30, maybe not in the same way, but I still expect to be doing this work. And, so I don't think I'm done yet to really think about that piece. And ultimately, I don't know if I'm the one that's going to decide on what my legacy is. It's going to be the people who read my work, and hopefully the students that I'm able to train over my career. They're going to be the ones that get to tell me what I think my legacy is. And I also don't like necessarily trying to guess what the end is, right? I try to tend to focus on sort of what's in front of me and looking at the problems that exist sort of, right in front and right at hand. And, maybe that's my pragmatism coming out. Maybe it's, I don't want to look too much at that, because then, that's the focus and trying to get there, then, I might, have too narrow of a focus. And so ultimately, I like to keep it really close, and I'm just not really yet at the point where I can look at my career and go, yeah, that's what I did. So maybe we'll have to do another interview and say, another decade or so, and we can check in and we can see where I'm at then. But if I can wish for one thing, if there is a hope, it's that people view my work as helpful, and hopefully I've helped shift how we view physical activity and how we approach the solutions to improve health outcomes for all people, but particularly for folks with disabilities, right? As one of the largest minority groups, particularly in the US and in Canada, people with disabilities are often, accommodations are often an afterthought in a lot of the things we do, and particularly within physical activity. And I hope that my work can help shift that perspective. And, I hope that ultimately my work can help reframe people's beliefs or at least question them about what physical activity is. And that ultimately people see my work as compassionate and respectful of the people in the cultures and the communities that I've worked within and that I've worked with.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, it sounds like you're off to a running start, Professor. And my final question for you is if you could wave a magic wand and sort of get advancements that you're currently working on or hoping for in the field that you work in, what is your greatest hope for promoting physical activity for people with autism and just the overall work that you do?
Yeah, I think if I could wave a wand and eradicate ableism, I would do it in a heartbeat. And of course, though, that would also mean getting rid of racism and sexism and homophobia and all of that goes into it, because those they're all the isms are inextricably linked. And I think to do that, in a practical sense, I think as we think about health and we think about who healthy people are, that we have to change what our ideal is, and we have to shift what is considered healthy. And that's not to say that there aren't certain diets and there certainly aren't kind of metaphysical things that are important for health that the scientists have told us to this point. But culturally, as we look at and we consider people who are healthy, we're often just, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a barrage, right? I mean, we constantly see images of able-bodied, very thin people as the pinnacle of what health is. And I think that is often, it's a negative, right? People who don't look like that feel bad for looking like that or not looking like that. And then people who do look like that have to maintain such an unhealthy level of either physical activity or restrictive diets that even that look isn't healthy. And so if I could change that, maybe that's a more practical one to do. I would certainly do that and shift people to say, just because you don't look like this doesn't mean you can't and are not healthy, right? Just because you're not Michael Phelps doesn't mean you can't go out and swim and swim for exercise and recreation. And just because you're not, Usain Bolt doesn't mean you can't go running. And just because you don't look like the athletes you see on TV doesn't mean you can't go out and enjoy a game. It doesn't mean that you can't go out and participate. And as an extension of that, just because you're playing the sport of basketball, for example, it doesn't mean that the rules are so sacred that you can't change them to accommodate somebody with a disability who might need the rules changed a little bit. It doesn't mean that you can't adapt and modify so that, you know, we can actually have fun together, right? I mean, the game is not sacred itself. And so if I could swing that wand and say, you know, just shift people's perspective of what that healthy, or, you know, what that goal, that person that we're trying to aim to be, if I can shift that to say, it doesn't have to be that, right? You can look how you look and still be healthy and still be active and still enjoy physical activity. And we can shift sport, right? I mean, most sports that we consider today have shifted over time. You know, in the US and Canada, right, we have, you know, American football, and the rules have changed for American football over the years. I mean, in the 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt forced them to change the rules because I think 10 or 13 people died in one season, right? And so the game of football is not a sacred game, right? I mean, all the rules of sport are not sacred. We just happen to hold them that way and they can't be changed because that's the way we know them. But that really limits people being able to access those sports, right? Who might need an accommodation, who might need it shifted. And so maybe that's what I would change, you know, allow people to just change a little bit of perspective, right? And maybe we can find a place in a society where, you know, people feel that they have agency and they ultimately reach that point where we feel included because we don't have to fight just to be in the room.
Absolutely. Hey, Professor, I really enjoyed our conversation about inclusion for people with autism when it comes to physical and active activity. Really want to thank you for being here this morning, for providing your expertise, insights, and perspective. I really want to thank you, and thanks for being here this morning. It's most appreciated.
Absolutely, Kevin. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.